Well, thanks for coming. Appreciate you being here. I know you have a choice of seminars, so glad to have you find your way to this one. This is not the easiest one to find, yeah? Right, at least it's not in the basement, I guess. So glad to have you. Let me say just a little bit, I'll do a little introduction, and then I'm going to give you the backstory for the content I'm going to then deliver. So that's kind of how it will go. And then there'll be time for questions at the end. So that's my plan anyway, and we'll see what happens along the way. So Rob Dixon, it's a joy to be at CBE. I feel like it's a bit of a family reunion. Is that the right metaphor? It's kind of like we correspond with some folks along the way during the year, but then we get together in the summer and reconnect. All we're missing are the color-coded family T-shirts that come with. Do you know what I'm talking about? Yeah. My wife comes from a huge Catholic family, and there's the reunions. We all wear our shirts anyway. So family reunion, this is my fourth CBE conference, my third time presenting actually at a CBE conference, which feels really honoring. And if you recognize me, it may be from two things. One, last in Houston, my colleague Lila and I, we were the MCs up front, so you might recognize me from that. The other thing I do with CBE is I'm on the podcast team. So you can hear me if you want Fridays. No, it's like the fourth Friday of each month, I think, is when our episodes drop. My colleague Lila and I host that. We interview ministry practitioners and ask the question, what can we learn from their story about women and men working together? And it's a blast. It's a blast to do the podcast. So, really good. Oh, thanks. Also on the podcast team, maybe slightly biased. Yeah, awesome. The other thing to say about me, I'm from Central California, so not the beach, not the big city, not the mountains so much. Think farmland and 102 degrees today. So there's your context. I also work with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. Do you know InterVarsity? Any InterVarsity folk? Okay, few. College ministry, this is year 26, I think, on staff with InterVarsity, which, can I just say, is crazy to say out loud because I so vividly remember my freaked out parents going, "You're coming on staff, you're going to fundraise," right? So, and I told them, just 3 years, Mom and Dad, just 3 years, it'll be fine. And here I am 26 years later. So, great. Well, that's a little bit about me. The other thing you should know is actually there should be a co-presenter this afternoon. So there should be a co-presenter. So everything I'm going to give you, I didn't make up myself. So a colleague, her name is Reverend April Feet, and I created this content together. So let me tell you a little bit about April. April's a pastor in western Nebraska in the town of Scotts Bluff, Nebraska, if you know your Nebraska geography. And April and I connected about 4 or 5 years ago through the Reformed Church in America. We need a shout out to the Reformed Church in America people. A few of them in here. All right. So we connected through some work we were doing with the RCA. It's called Building God's Church Together. So we made the rounds with some pastors and leaders in the RCA and some churches, trying to help them envision and embody the stuff we're talking about here at CBE. So how do women and men share leadership? We had some one-day training events with pastors, and then we took it online. And in the midst of all of that, April and I started hearing stories from pastors that went something like this. Our church wants to make this theological switch from complementarian to egalitarian, but we don't know how to do it. There's no roadmap. We also heard stories like, we tried to make the pivot and it didn't really work very well. Or we heard stories like, well, we're nervous about it. If there was a way to know where we were going, that would help us, right? And so Reverend Liz Testa, right back there, commissioned us, April and I, to do a survey or to do some research on this. And so we started interviewing people. We met with pastors and leaders of churches who had successfully made the pivot from complementarian to egalitarian. We interviewed people whose churches had not successfully made the pivot, people who were in the middle of that. And then we sifted a whole bunch of data, right? Had a bunch of stories and we sifted all of that. And what emerged from that is what I'm going to present for you this afternoon. A process, a 5-step process that churches can use to make that pivot. Now, I think you'll find that this process could also work for other things that you're thinking about in a church context. It's sort of a framework for any change process, but specifically for us, the question was, how can churches make the move from complementarian to egalitarian. And we landed on these 5 things. Bless you. Okay, so that's a little bit of the backstory. Ultimately, our research got written up. We wrote it up, and it went into Missio Alliance, published it for us, which was great. And then Fuller Seminary did a short little online course about it. So it's out there. And I'm excited to put it out today and get your feedback on it. So that's what we have. So making the shift. Here's the... Okay, so let me start with a story, and then I'll get into the meat of the content. April 17th, 2016, April 17th, 2016 is a day, Lord willing, that will go down in history. In the church called Bent Tree Bible Fellowship, a prominent church on the outskirts of Dallas, Texas, April 17th, 2016. On that day, a group of male elders and their senior pastor, Pete Briscoe, stood up on stage, or sat on stools maybe, trying to remember, got up on stage and announced that Bent Tree was now, for the first time in its history, fully egalitarian. That all offices of the church were open to women. Up until that point, there had been one exception, and that was the role of elder. And now they were announcing, we've made the full shift, and we are now fully and completely egalitarian. It was a key moment. I mean, it was a powerful moment. You can watch the video online. If you Google Bent Tree Bible Fellowship, you'll see it. It's powerful, even after all these years, to watch that. It's a key moment, right? And here's what they said. Where's my PowerPoint? Right here. Here's what they said. Part of it, anyway. And I'll read this for you. Hopefully you can see it. After careful study, reflection, discussion, and prayer, we have unanimously, we being the elder board and the pastors, we have unanimously come to the conclusion that God is calling us to be a community of faith committed to conservative theology in a community where women gifted by the Spirit experience no limits or restrictions on their service. We joyfully, and I love that they added that word, we joyfully agree to invite women to share leadership as elders. That's a big moment in the life of that church, right? I mean, you just sort of look at that and you think, I just want every church to write that statement and share it and trumpet it, right? It's a beautiful moment. And we went back and we looked at Bent Tree's process. We listened to the interviews that we did. We coded all of the data and we came up with a 5-fold process. And so I'm going to share it as an overview right now, and then I'll go through each step. Can you see that? Maybe? All right. You can come up later and take a picture if you want, or if you zoom in, just don't get me in the picture, right? 5 steps. First, identify the catalyst. So something or someone drives the change, and the first step is to know who or what that is. So pay attention to the catalyst. Second, gather some leaders, and I'll talk about that shortly, but some group, smaller group, discerns what to do in response to the catalyst. Number 3, declare a decision. So this is the moment that Bent Tree I'll talk about their process, but this is where it gets announced, right? 4th, engage the congregation, the big congregation, everyone, all the stakeholders and constituents need to be engaged well, right? And then lastly, implement the change. Don't stop with the statement. Don't stop with everybody on board. Now's the time to roll up your sleeves and get to work, right? So there's your 5 steps. You can see, right, how this would apply in other areas that you're trying to bring change, but we'll talk about it specifically in the midst of this shift from complementarian to egalitarian. Okay, so first, I'll take them each in turn. Let's talk about the catalyst. So not to take you back to high school chemistry here, right? But you know what catalysts do? You put a catalyst into the system and it tweaks the system in some way, and you observe that, right? Similarly, when a church is thinking about making this theological move, there's someone or something that drives that change. There's a catalyst, and we want to know who or what that is. Someone or something is going to have to drive the process. It's not going to happen without a catalyst. In the case of Bent Tree Bible, they really had twin catalysts. They had 2 of them, and I'll share them with you, and I'll give you more examples. So one was the pastor. Pete Briscoe, for years, had this growing conviction that shared leadership was the way to go, and he started nudging the church for years in that direction. By the way, I don't mean to imply that this process will always take years, but at least in their case, he had been moving the church subtly but consistently toward an egalitarian experience and understanding, right? So there's this sort of Pete Briscoe, person catalyzing the move. The second thing was, I would say, some sort of growing dissonance on the part of the leadership team and the congregation, that what they said they believed, everyone has a seat at the table, right? Shared leadership is the way we want to be. What they said they believed did not match what was actually happening in the room, right? Well, we still have an exception. That doesn't feel right. And over time, that dissonance just sort of grew. They paid attention to that, and it catalyzed their process. I would actually call dissonance is one way to describe it. I would call it a holy discontent, right? I think God's working in that situation, and what you espouse isn't matching what's actually happening. I think God works in the midst of that dissonance. So there's a catalyst. Those were the bent tree catalysts. When we did our survey and our research, we got a lot of examples of catalysts. One church told us about a woman in their community who was leading, and it was undeniable that she was gifted, good at it, and that provoked a theological switch. That started the process of reevaluating their theology. This undeniably gifted and called woman who was living out of her gifts and her calling, and it just was like so vivid. They couldn't help but reevaluate their theology. That was one example. Another one was sometimes there's an external catalyst, right? So at one church, they talked about how a group of people had read a book together. I forget what it was now off the top of my head. But they read this book and they were like, that makes a lot of sense. Maybe we should consider that, right? In the last couple of months, years, Jesus and John Wayne, and there's been a number of books out, right? Making a Biblical Womanhood, that I think have really provoked people to start asking questions, and that can catalyze and start this process of reevaluation. And then most often in our stories, a catalyst is a person, a leader, or at least not necessarily a pastor, someone with some clout, a mover and shaker in the church community that has influence, that says, we should rethink our theology here. We're not doing this right. There's a different way to go about this. It's a prophetic kind of voice, right, that they exercise. Sometimes those leaders are pastors, but they can also be prominent lay leaders as well. And as we dug sort of deeper in this idea of a person catalyzing a process, what we realized, people started to tell us stories about how they really tried hard to keep it healthy for that catalyst, right? That person was going out on a limb, a prophetic limb, and speaking into the system. And if you've been in that place before, or you know people who've been in that place before, that can be a hard road, right? And so what these pastors were telling us was, this woman had this conviction, she was bringing it, she was consistent about it, and they realized, I need to care for this person, right? So what does it look like to care for the catalyst, right? A couple days ago, I was in Chicago doing a training with some pastors, and a woman came up to me at the break and had the conversation that I often have with people, which is, I'm an egalitarian in a complementarian setting, what should I do? I get that question a lot. Maybe some of you have that question. And I've learned over time, maybe the hard way, to first, that's so hard, try to affirm where she's at. Second, I've learned not to prescribe a solution. Instead, what I say is, what is Jesus telling you? As best as you can tell, what's Jesus telling you? To stay, to go? We have that dialogue. And then what we landed was, she said pretty quickly, she goes, oh no, I'm staying. Like she was like, I got some fire about this, right? And I'm ready to do it. And so my question then to her was, what's your system to keep you healthy, to keep you engaged, to keep you on the playing field, right? What for the long term, not just for the next month, but for the next 6 months, year, what's your community like? All of those kinds of questions. Does that make sense? So when the catalyst is a person and is really working at this sort of prophetic word, we want to care for the catalyst well. So that's our first step was identify the catalyst and pay attention to that. Okay, so there's this energy coming from the catalyst. What's the next step? Is to gather the leaders. Gather the leaders. So at a certain point, this came up again, a trend in the stories, was at a certain point we need to gather a smaller group of people to pay attention to the catalyst and ask the question, what do we do in response to that? It's really a discernment step, the second step in the process. What's our response to the catalyst? And in Bentry's case, this involved, right, we're going to go straight to the elders and gather them and really pray into this. And in other churches, that was also the case. Some sort of leadership community is gathered for the purpose of discerning next steps. Oftentimes that is the elder board, like with Bent Tree, but other times it was actually the pastoral leadership team if the church was probably a little bit bigger. And then in one case, someone told us a story about how the pastor assembled a task force, like a cross-section of people from around the congregation to sit together and discern how to respond to the catalyst's energy. There's different ways to do it, but the main point is there are leaders that are gathered. And so then the question is, what do they do when they gather, right? And people told us a lot, it gave us a lot of examples. They study Scripture. They study Scripture. Side note, and I'm on my soapbox a little bit here, but I think in most of our churches, and it's true in InterVarsity as well, I'll own it, I think a lot of people have a theology, but they haven't done the Bible study work, the biblical work to understand that. They've just breathed the air of some theological environment they've been in, right? So biblical literacy is, I think, what we need to push people to. And so these elder teams and these leadership teams would tell stories of like, yeah, we were deep in the Scriptures, studying it ourselves and wrestling with the text. So that'd be one example. They also read books. There are plenty, as we know from our book table, right? Plenty of books to read. There's articles to read, a couple stories of bringing in experts. So one church told us about, we went to our local seminary and said, who can speak on this? Come on in, like help us as a team sort out the issues. They deliberate, they pray, they deliberate, they pray, they deliberate, they pray, right? Back and forth, and they discern. And at some point, they hear from God. And that really is, I think, the key of this second step is, what is God saying to us about our theology on women in leadership, about our practice of women in leadership? Like, what is God saying to us about the potential of this shift? Bent Tree Bible, their process, by the way, at this last stage, I'm trying to remember exact the details, but the elders, they spent a year discerning. And at the very end, I think how it went was each of the elders went off on their own and did a focused study, all the things I talked about, books, Scripture, all that, wrote a position paper, each elder did, and then they came back and they had to present. And you remember that statement from earlier? They said they unanimously, when they presented, they were all on the same page. I mean, can you imagine that moment of like, whoa, right? We have heard from God. Maybe in the front end, it's a little nerve-wracking. Yeah. Great question. Yep. You just led me right to my next point, which is, before we move to the third step, the big question at this step in the process is, do you let the entire community know? You want to come up and, okay, right? Do we let the community know? And I think that's a crucial question. What we found out as we did the interviews, there's pros and cons to that, right? On a pro, the pros would be like the people can be praying, or maybe they have resources that the leadership team needs to hear, or maybe they're not going to be more accustomed to the process, and so the result won't be as crazy, as difficult or whatever, but digestible. There's also cons, because people have opinions. People don't like ambiguity. It's tough to wait. I think it increases the pressure on the process and on the leadership team, right? So where April and I landed was, we think when the leaders gather, the first question is, how wide do we announce this? When's the right point to bring the congregation into this? And I think that might have to be like a situational piece of discernment to understand that. Does that answer your question? It's a great question, yeah. So that's a tough one. Great. So gather the leaders. Third step in the process is to declare a decision. And this is like the moment of truth. It's like the gut check moment, right? And it's often a singular moment in time. I started out talking about April 17th, 2016, right? That's a particular moment where this church was changed forever, we hope, right? So it's often a singular moment, but it can be a series of moments as well. So this step is unique in that sense. It's a one-off kind of moment. This is a moment that's obviously pivotal because you're announcing what you understand God to be doing. God is moving us from complementarian understanding to an egalitarian understanding, or maybe more like from saying we're egalitarian to actually being egalitarian. I don't know what the actual change is, but it's this announcement. It's this public proclamation. It's this declaration. This is who we are. This is what we sense God doing in us. And so it's a key moment. It's also a moment that could provoke feelings. It could provoke pushback. It could provoke some sense of division. And people told us stories. Yeah, this cost us, right? So it's not a moment to be taken lightly. It's a moment to be surrounded by prayer, well thought out, all of those things. The process took several forms, and I'll give you some examples of this. So a lot of people told us stories about how they had a well-written, crafted theological statement, a paper. Right? Ben Tree has a great paper. You can find it online. I recommend it. There are other examples where a church says, this is what we believe God to be calling us to, right? And there's a paper that goes out. Often it's a sermon or maybe a short sermon series that lays out the church's new position. A couple of churches told us stories about how this required a bylaw shift. I'm not a church polity expert, right? But there's some bylaws that need to be changed. And so it came out in the context of like a congregational meeting, and we need to tangibly change these rules of the church. Or another one told us a story, a couple actually, of like a town hall meeting, right? Where it's like the pastor gets a chair, sits up front and says, this is what we're doing. What questions do you have? Something like that, right? But there's this moment, this gut check moment where the decision is declared. One more thing I'll say on this before we move to the next one, which is I think the key when whoever gets up front and announces the decision is clarity. You want to be as clear as you can possibly be. I have a good friend who quotes Brene Brown all the time, who says that clarity is kindness, right? And I think even if people are going to be put off by the theological shift, clarity is kindness. You want to be as clear as you can possibly be when you declare a decision. Yeah. Okay, fourth step, engage the congregation. So please, don't declare a decision and then just walk off the stage, right? Declare a decision and then guide the community into response. And that's what this fourth step gets to, engaging the congregation. The congregation should be thoughtfully and generously engaged. It's not enough to produce a great paper or deliver a great sermon. The congregation has to be pastored, and that's probably the key word here, pastored through the process. So in our study, we discern kind of three features of this step of the process, I'll say. One is intentionality. So the people that did this best, that walked their people through an engagement experience, were super intentional. They had thought it all out, right? And they were responsive when they needed to be in the moment, but they were super intentional and proactive. So to say, this is where we've landed, this is what we feel like God is saying, and here's our next steps, and it's all clearly laid out so that people know how they're going to respond or what their avenues or channels are for that, right? Second, one theme that emerged in the research was a plurality of opportunities. Lots of opportunities for people to connect and process. I'll give you some examples. Bent Tree, they did a lot of one-on-one conversation. So it was like, Elder Fred is going to be available, these days. Feel free to, a lot of trips to Starbucks, I'm guessing, right? Like lots of conversations with people where questions could be answered. Other churches I'd mentioned the town hall route. One pastor told us he had 3 different town hall meetings and he needed to add more. Just because people had questions and they wanted to be heard. And he was like, that's important. So yes, let's make space. He was generous about that. What else? Some other examples. So resource lists, right? If you want to follow the path that the elders took, read these books, and we'll have some book groups. We'll talk about these together. Resource lists, sermon series, seminars. So I think the pastor that found the seminary professor to come talk to the elder board also came back and talked to the congregation, right? In a smaller kind of venue. But there were just lots of channels and opportunities for people to respond. And then the last thing that came out as a theme in this step in the process is just the pastoral care that's embedded into it. Just a ton of pastoral care. Pastors told us, look, we had to free up our schedule. It meant that other stuff couldn't get done because we felt an obligation to pastor and an invitation to pastor people well. right? And to really engage with people where they're at. And that's especially true if there's some level of backlash. If there's people that are hurt, if there's people that are going to decide to leave. One pastor said to us, look, we lost some people, not as many as we thought. We lost some people. But he said, my commitment was they would leave as well as humanly possible. And I asked him, well, what did that mean? And he said, well, I'm going to talk as long as they want. And we're going to leave as best we can, brothers and sisters who bless each other to find a different community to be a part of, right? That's like next level. I mean, that was impressive to hear that, right? That he was so committed to this, that he was willing to walk people out the door of the church, literally. So, pastor. I think this step can take weeks, maybe even months, and you don't want to rush it. I think you want to give people the chance to be heard and to ask their questions in a pastoral sense. Okay, last one, implement the change. April loves, when we talk about this one, April will say, like, please don't do all the work and then not actually do the work, right? Or I was talking with a woman whose church made this shift recently, and we were celebrating that on Zoom, and she's telling me, oh, it feels so good to be at the finish line of the process, right? Which I can totally understand because the process was intense for her. Intense. I just walked alongside her and tried to encourage her for about, 6 or 7 months. And so that made sense to me, but then I had to sort of go, sorry, because the finish line is also the starting line, right? The finish line is also the starting line. So I know you're tired from the process, but if you don't start doing something with this now, what did it all mean, right? So I think that could be a tough word, but I think implementation starts ASAP. And so in this final step in the roadmap, the theological shift provokes other shifts, right? So cultural, what's the culture of the church? Or structural shifts, or maybe shifts in personnel, or other kinds of sort of movement that needs to happen in the way the church operates. April says, how the church does church needs to change, right? And I think that's right. Let me give you a couple of examples, concrete ones from our research process. One pastor told us the first thing he did after they declared a decision and engaged the congregation was we had some retitling work to do. No longer were women directors, now they are pastors, right? Which they always have been functionally, but without the title. So they had to, that's one shift they made right away. Took some work, bylaw changes, I think, probably. Right, so that was one example. Another one, pastor said to me, pretty quickly, I walked into the sanctuary and took out all the Bibles that weren't gender inclusive in their translation, and off they went to wherever Bibles go when you're done with them. Right, and then here comes Amazon. So he was like, that was one thing we needed to do tangibly to change this. Other pastors talked about raising up women to preach in the pulpit. And maybe it's not right away like a woman's doing like a 6-part sermon series. Maybe it's like, let's co-teach, and then we'll work our way towards that, right? But there was tangible movement there. Or women to serve on the elder board, deacons, and then just in general, intentionally placing women in positions where people can see the tangible, lived out experience that comes from the theological shift, so that it's not just words, it's also actions, right? Okay, that's the, so don't stop before implementation. Let me do one more thing with you, and then I'll have space for questions. So I'm going to give you a case study. Pastor Gabe. You ready to meet Pastor Gabe? Pastor Gabe was a student of mine in InterVarsity back in the day. I'm talking like 25 years ago. He was a student. And I knew Gabe right away. He was one of those students that just stands out, like unafraid, risk taker, evangelist, like a wonderful student. Gabe also came from a really conservative background, like I won't name that. Anyway, like a really intense conservative background, including complementarian. And so our InterVarsity community back then and now, we took our egalitarianism seriously. And so I knew it was going to be an awkward fit for Gabe. He lasted 2 years. And then he eventually said, I got to find a place where I can fellowship that aligns with my theology, right? Which I could affirm. I was like, yes, you should do that. As often happens when people leave, I sort of lost track of Gabe. I knew that he graduated. I knew that he went to Talbot Seminary, which is in LA. I knew that he became a pastor of a complementarian church, and then he dropped off my radar screen. A little bit on Facebook here and there, but he sort of dropped off the screen. Gabe did. About 6 months ago, I get a note from Gabe on social media. He reaches out, I think, on Twitter, and he says to me, "Hey, can we talk? Do you remember me?" Yes, of course. "Can we talk?" I said, "Absolutely." So we got on Zoom, and he tells me that he's had an epiphany. He's had a moment, and he has personally changed his theology from complementarian to egalitarian. And there's a lot of factors there, right? It was like, I had a daughter, okay, all right? And then he was like, something just wasn't feeling right about the scriptures on this. 2 Timothy 2 didn't quite, or 1 Timothy 2 didn't quite, wasn't feeling right anymore, right? And I saw the obvious gifting of women. He had all these things, which, sort of side note here, people can change their theology, right? I don't know if you need to hear that today, but Gabe changed. And man, that conversation was the best Zoom I think I'll have all year, because it was so fun to know that God was at work in his life. I had nothing to do with it. And God brought him back around. And so anyway, Gabe asks me, he goes, "Now, how to help me think about how to change my church?" I have an article for you, Gabe, right? So we walked through this together. And I thought I would just say a little bit about Gabe's journey through this lens of the five things. So let me go to that, back to that. First, identify a catalyst. Well, Gabe himself is the catalyst, right? He is the person bringing the energy and trying to bring the change. Now, I think that's complex. It's not a huge church, and I think it's complex for Gabe to be the catalyst. I've encouraged him to find allies that feel similar to what he does, so that it's not just him driving the change. I think when the pastor is driving the change, particularly in a small setting, the stakes feel really high for that pastor. Like, pushback on the theology is personal pushback as well. Those two things are integrated, and I think that's really hard for a pastor. So Gabe's working on this, but he is the catalyst. And so pretty quickly I was like, let's keep meeting, because I want to try to care for him. I want to resource him. I want to pray for him, right? So we've been Zooming from time to time. And I emailed him even just right before this. So Gabe's the catalyst. Second, gather the leaders. So Gabe said, first thing, when I talked about this model, he goes, "That's my elder team." There are 4 elders in addition to Gabe. So he said, I need to go to the elder team first and talk about this and share with them my heart, right? So we talked about ways to do that. The elders have prayed. Now, 6 months have gone by. The elders have prayed. They've talked. They've done their theological work, their biblical work. They've talked some more. I love how Gabe, this is from, I'll read you a quote from his email. He's done his homework. I think he's got a good read on people. He says, "Our elders have been very open to the idea." Praise God. "Although they still have some hesitations. They have asked some very good questions and have taken their role of study and prayer seriously. We have 5 elders, and 3 of us are on board for the full inclusion of women in ministry. The other 2 are open, but not there yet." So to me, that was a pretty good mid-process report card, right? He's working on it, and he knows it's not going to be something that happens overnight. He's got to keep, it's like the flywheel. You just keep adding a little bit of energy that it moves faster and faster, right? So he's working on it with the leaders. Number 3, declare a decision. Now, the big danger to offering a model like this is you think, oh, it's so simple and clean. Every process runs like that, doesn't it? Well, of course not, right? Of course not. And Gabe's a good example. There can be some variety. Gabe has not declared a decision yet, at least with the congregation. He's not. I think he wants to, but it feels a little early because he doesn't have his leaders on board, right? The leaders haven't heard from God yet, and he wants to hold off on that. But Gabe did write a paper. Oh, he wrote a long paper. I read it. I edited it. It was a long paper. It's pretty solid, though. And he's used that paper to catalyze the process with the elders. And I think ultimately when he's ready to declare a decision, he can share that paper more broadly, right? So he's ready for this 3rd step. The 4th one, engage the congregation. I'm going to call Gabe's process a really soft rollout. Okay, so he's actually started to do a little bit of this, even though he hasn't done step 3. What he's done He hasn't done a listening post or a sermon series or anything like that, but he has started to meet one-on-one with key congregants, just to sound them out, hear a little bit about their journey. He's a great question asker, I've discovered. So he's like asking good. I like to think InterVarsity had a small part to play in him becoming a good, who knows, right? But he's a good question asker. And I think he's really started to lay the groundwork that later it will be really beneficial. I think the approach suits him. And I think it sounds like it suits his congregation as well. So he started to engage the congregation maybe in more of like a backstage kind of way. And then implementing the change, Gabe's been teaching me something here because he has taken baby steps, nothing crazy, but he has taken baby steps to start implementing the change even now, right? So this is again from the email the other day. He said, one thing we, the elder board, unanimously agreed upon already was opening up more opportunities for women in our church to use their gifts to minister to the church. I have invited a young woman to co-preach with me later this summer. Okay? That feels significant, with the hopes of equipping her to preach solo soon after that. We will also invite some women in our church to lead communion, which we do on a weekly basis. I'm excited about these steps and hopeful it leads to more in the coming months. Amen. May it be so. And again, I'm learning as he does this, right? Because the linear sequential thing isn't quite what Gabe's doing. It's a little bit more overlapped and nuanced, right? Where he started steps 4 and 5, even though he hasn't gone through step 3 yet. And I think my gut says it's going to bear fruit for him when we get to the point where he has to get up in front of the congregation and announce their decision, right? So there's Gabe for you, and there's our 5-step process. Identify the catalyst, gather the leaders, declare a decision, engage the congregation, and then actually roll up your sleeves and get to work implementing the change. Okay, pretty good. What questions do you have for me? Or does this strike anything in you that you've been thinking about? Go ahead.